We are here live on March 4th, 2018, with another edition of Chalcedon's Q&A, Some Meat of the Word. I'm Martin Selbrede, and we are here broadcasting from Georgetown, Texas. Ground control is available in other states on the other side of the country. We have the whole country braced. Andrea's with us. Thank you, Andrea. She'll be making sure that our feed gets through to the Chalcedon EDU website. So you can watch this either directly on Facebook, where we're broadcasting from, or directly on chalcedon.edu. The only limitation being on the Chalcedon EDU is you cannot ask live questions. However, you can submit questions to ask.chalcedon@chalcedon.edu in advance. And we get several questions every session. And in fact, we're going to always hit those questions first. So we have about 5 or 6 of those. We'll deal with them. One question that was posed dealt with the timing of the property tax. There seems to be a conflict in Dr. Rushdoony's writings. In Tithing and Dominion, he places it in the 18th and 19th century in America. And yet in the Institutes of Biblical Law, there's a reference to the property tax in the United States being in the 17th century, when there barely actually was no United States quite yet. Those were colonies, not yet affiliated either under Articles of Confederation or under the Constitution, as we are today, for better or worse. So, likelihood is this is actually an error in Institutes of Biblical Law, of which there turned out to be many typos in that book, and we've been trying to track them down, incorrect scripture references, things in this order. Part of the problem is that he tended to write in longhand, and sometimes the person typing would misinterpret the longhand word. We saw something like that very similar when we just recently printed a snippet from his commentary on Deuteronomy. The word was something like designation, and it really needed to be desecration. And so we corrected it when we printed it in Faith for All of Life. So that's the bottom of the line. Yeah, we're good to go. Good to hear that. Gwen, good to see that you're here. Greetings from Texas. So we're going to look into that question that was raised by one of our viewers and see if, in fact, there is an error in Institutes of Biblical Law that needs to be corrected, because it will be reprinted, and that's the time for us to catch all the errors. Up until now, Presbyterian Reformed held the publishing rights, and they simply saw no reason to modify anything. It was just a good-selling book of theirs, and they just kept putting it out there. And as long as they did, they could hold on to the publishing rights. But the good news is we'll be taking it back under wing and making those corrections to the book. So that's the good news. Also, I want to say before we get too much farther, and we'll repeat it at the end of our discussion here, is that tomorrow we will have a Chalcedon Book of the Month. If you have not signed up for it, please look it up and get signed up. We'll be discussing the issue of Neoplatonism. Flight from Humanity is the book in question. And Gordon Runyon out of New Mexico is going to be the one leading or hosting that with Andrea Schwartz. Very important material, because it turns out so much of Christendom has been eviscerated under the influence of Neoplatonic thinking, which essentially derails us. I think I spoke a little bit about this last week. So, hey Glenn, glad to have you here too. Been a long time since we've seen each other. Okay, so let's go through the questions that we have online that were submitted. And sometimes if you have a long question, it's best to submit online, because at the moment we use this little teeny iPhone, and that iPhone only seems to let 4 lines of a question show up before it blocks them out, which is very unhelpful to me. It makes it look very unprofessional, and it's bad enough because I'm not professional to start with. So it just compounds an existing problem. The other problem we had is some folks have said the audio is very, very light, very, very recessive, if you will. It's not loud enough. So we've come up with this little device here from LG, which is a Bluetooth connector. And of course, the Bluetooth decided not to connect this morning. So I have everything necessary except the connection to improve our audio. So I was told the alternative is to speak louder and get hoarse. We'll be drinking lots of water at that rate, won't we? Good. Chalcedon, our ground control here, is giving us the link to get to the Book of the Month Club link for tomorrow, if you can all make it. The subsequent month, we'll be talking about The Cure of Souls. I will be the host on that. I'm the one who ended up writing the foreword for that book, so I have a little something to say about it. So that should be also exciting. But tomorrow is the one you want to get to if you want to understand the dangers of Neoplatonism, where it came from and how it affects and how it cuts the nerve cord out of Christian activism because of its reorientation of everything. Very dangerous. Okay, so here's the question, first question on the official list. In Rushdoony's audio series Eschatology, he states that the word eschatology from the Greek does not only mean a study of the end times, although this is one of its meanings, but that it also means end points, and in some cases a succession of end points in time. How then would you respond to the accusation that Rushdoony is redefining this key term in order to support his particular perspective? Well, the point of the matter is, you could still hold to end points and be a premill dispensationalist, so it doesn't really support the position one way or the other. So the critique or the challenge is a misfire for several reasons. For example, there is not a single eschatology book out there, or a systematic theology book for that matter, by any camp that doesn't distinguish between personal eschatology, that is, what happens to you and your soul when you die, when you end your earthly life here, and cosmic eschatology, which is the end of the world stuff. What happens when God wraps up history and eternity comes into play. So we already have a distinction between cosmic eschatology and personal eschatology. And once you have that, and every single systematic theology book out there has that, you've already made a distinction, that there are a bunch of endpoints, because there are different people dying all this time. And then you have the cosmic eschatology, which wraps everything up with a final bang, if you will, whatever the shape that's going to take. So it's a misnomer to say that this is a forced fit by Dr. Rushdoony. In fact, what he's doing is expanding the meaning to everything that Scripture embraces, because you can have all sorts of eschatology, all sorts of endpoints. And most of those endpoints are predetermined by what you began with, right? So if you start with false premises, your endpoint will be myth. This happens in philosophy, this happens in education, this happens across the board. So eschatology has a very, very broad meaning. It means that everything has an end purpose, a telos that it's driving toward. The entire universe is driving toward purpose. The only people who have purposelessness are the hardcore evolutionists who say the universe will die a heat death billions of years from now, and that's their eschatology. That's their end point. Even so, they have to talk about the end point of many, many different living creatures that die. So there's always some end point somewhere. By saying it's an end point, eschatos, Dr. Rushdoony is saying that things drive to that purpose, and the question is, do they fulfill that purpose? Is it a good purpose or a bad purpose? So it's an expansion. It's not a denial of cosmic eschatology. It's a filling out of the implications of what's going on until we reach the cosmic point where history concludes. What is history pushing forward to? But we also have to deal with what's going on with, say, this nation, this culture here. What's the end point of this culture? It's interesting to note that in the past, when people would try to describe notions of how a culture or a nation would go through its lifespan, if you will, they would use like a biological model. They talk about the infancy of a nation, and then its adolescence, and its prime, and then its senescence, and finally its death of a culture. So you have the analogy of a living thing. Then you have the ballistic model, the rise and the fall, say, of the Roman Empire. It's like you shoot a cannonball and it's going to describe this big arc. So each of these are different approaches, but they all end up at the same end point in some kind of way. But when you have a covenantal model, then God is the one who sets in motion the ends and the means to the ends. So Dr. Rushdoony's Eschatology series is unique in providing a broader base and a foundation for understanding. It's not a denial, it's rather a filling out. I think hope that explains what's going on. It's a false charge, basically, and probably because people assume that his view of endpoints leads to, say, a post-millennial eschatology. That's not necessarily true. What it does lead to is a better understanding of all the aspects of eschatology and how they work together toward the consummation. One way that Dr. Bonson put it is he said that things are providentially arranged to serve the consummation purposes, not to head in the wrong direction, but rather to orchestrate together under God's watchful eye under his decree. Here's a tough one. Short but tough question. Does pornography constitute an unfaithfulness in marriage? Would this be grounds for divorce under the banner of adultery? So let's be clear that there's a problem with the one word unfaithfulness. And I'm not excusing any viewing of pornography. Let's make very clear on that too. But the problem with the word unfaithfulness is that it says it constitutes in unfaithfulness, a form of unfaithfulness, a kind of unfaithfulness. And the answer is absolutely. If nothing else, the oath of marriage generally has a forsaking of all others clause in it. Forsaking all others, you devote yourself to the one, your spouse. And if there's pornography involved after that point, then there's been no forsaking at all, in fact. Those others are all very much present in the marriage, perhaps surreptitiously and on the sly, but nonetheless they're poisoning the marriage. So it is an unfaithfulness. There's a sense in which that oath is being violated by the person caught up in the pornography. Now, the other point is this exactly what is dealt with when Jesus is talking about grounds for divorce, or when Paul is talking about it? Is it this specific adultery, or is he talking about rather the actual act of fornication, where the adultery is then consummated, if you will? This gets us back to Jesus' comment about looking at a woman lustfully, have already committed adultery with them in their heart. So the question is that Jesus is talking about the heart of man, where all the moral issues need to be dealt with. So it's a big deal. It's very, very difficult to say that it's the exact same unfaithfulness. It may well be. I'm not comfortable to prognosticate on this. It is the problem. Because there's a violation of a covenant oath in the marriage that's already occurred, and is a poisonous one that destroys the marriage, destroys trust. All the things that make for the covenant of marriage to be successful are being, even if on the sly, hidden covertly, are being undermined. So marriage is being undermined from within by presumably the man, though it doesn't mean that it couldn't be the woman. Usually it's always pinned to be the man for obvious reasons, that they tend to dominate in this area, at least among Christians, right? Which means that this particular sin, which is called a dissipating sin for a reason. What's a dissipating sin? It's the one that steals the strength of your moral character from you and makes you less of a man or less of a woman as a consequence of it. It drains you of your humanity, and it drains you of your ability to be available for your spouse in the covenant that you're in. So the dangers of pornography are very, very important. I believe I can certainly refer us back to the discussion of on the Book of the Month Club talk about Noble Savages, where Mark Rushdoony deals with this problem in additional detail concerning this matter. So it's a very important point, and sadly enough, we have not ruled on it in terms of, say, churches and things like this. There's this deals with the question of false forgiveness, things like this. And we are not dealing properly with the matter, and therefore I think it's still an open area that needs to be discussed and worked on at the church level. It requires perhaps a 96 thesis compared to the 95 that were recently published last year in that wonderful book that Reverend Aaron Hebbard edited. So, all that to say, it's a very, very serious matter. It may well constitute potential grounds for divorce. It's a matter that needs to be looked at further. We don't want to minimize and trivialize the seriousness of it, or let anyone off on a technicality. This is exactly where Jesus was able to pin down the Pharisees on their notions of technicalities. So we should not be doing the same thing. We should treat it with extreme gravity as a betrayal in the marriage. And if we treat it at least that much, we might have a better angle at dealing with it. This is a bane for Christian counselors. We are a swamp with it. That's why I think it's wise for folks who want to pursue this question to, if you haven't read the book by Rushdoony, Noble Savages, originally titled The Politics of Pornography. There's a reason why our culture is awash in it. There's a design behind that purpose, and it's having its impact on us, generally speaking, as Christians. So, it's an area to explore. Third question. And I haven't had a chance to take a good hard look at this one yet, so almost as if it was a live question. There are those who wish to adopt children and cannot afford to do so, except to go through the state's foster care system. This often involves the state coming in to approve the house and examine the other family members. Some argue that the trade-off is a good one because the Bible says to care for orphans. Please comment. Secondly, the state often continues to provide Social Security payments even after adoption and provides medical care for the adoptees until they reach the age of maturity. Is accepting this money a violation of God's law? These are two very, very complex questions, obviously. So, do you want to take care of a child? You want to adopt a child, and you have to go through Caesar to get to the child, to raise the child. See, it used to be in the Roman Empire, those such children that were not wanted were deposited as usually as infants, and they had to be weaned on the shores of the Tiber River, boom, and the Christians would go out at night and collect them. That was the way that Rome dealt with it. Now Rome deals with it more differently. You have to get your paperwork together to collect the child. But I think the importance of raising the child in the faith, to grab the brand in the fire burning that would otherwise be left in the foster care system forever, perhaps you have a chance to redeem and speak into a life in a positive way. I think that overcomes the state's to say, I'm sorry, I can't help you guys because the state's in the way. I'm just going to not dirty my hands by helping this orphan, because if I did so, then I might have to sign a piece of paper that the state has. It seems to me that that's looking through the wrong end of the telescope. The need of the human being is more important than the institutional question at that stage in life. And to raise a child in the faith and bring them up as a quiver in the kingdom of God is going to outweigh anything that, in principle, that's at least represented in the question here. Then the other point is, the state is going to continue, like I said, Social Security payments, even after adoption, provide medical care for the adoptees until they reach the age of maturity. It seems to me that if you are in opposition to that, and there are good biblical reasons why you might want to say, I don't want to have Caesar's money. These are all, every dime that comes from Caesar has a string attached, and they're usually bad from a Christian point of view. You could simply turn around and donate that money to the kingdom of God instead. So it seems like if this is the cost to raise a child in the kingdom of God, versus turn them over to the devil, to humanism, to atheism, to whatever else is out there, you're in a hard spot. We talked about this last week. Lot had nothing but bad options in front of him. But the one thing that might have been clear in the case of this adoption is this child needs to be raised in a Christian home. And if all the Christians are going to say, hands off, because the state's putting some strings on that I don't like as a Christian, then of course Satan wins. And if that's the alternative, then I think we better get our hands dirty. A couple more technical questions here. This has to do with the land Sabbaths. Well, actually, let me talk about this too. There was a question that came in. We did not answer it last week. It had to do with, do you plan to respond to the book written by Dr. Gary North called Tithing in the Church? It should be pointed out that 1994 book, which is available for free online in the public domain, is also has been expanded, if you will, in a new form called the Covenantal Tithe, published in 2011. And we intend to eventually review these books. I always have to prioritize all the tasks that we have in front of us to try to have as broad an attack, if you will, on all fronts to show that it's faith for all of life, not faith for some of life, or faith for our favorite topics or our points that we like to talk about. I don't want to just always talk about the Reconstructionist talking points. Don't always deal with merely social theory, because if we're doing that, then we're ignoring the fact that it's a faith for all of life. So we will get to it, and it will be discussed, and we definitely do oppose his view. We believe the position in Tithing and Dominion by Dr. Rushdoony and Edward Powell stands unrefuted, even by Dr. North's efforts to make that so, to refute it. So a counter-rebuttal is in order, and we will go ahead and mount that. It'll probably appear next week. Not next week, next year. If it appears next week, it won't be me doing that, I can guarantee it. However, one of the individuals who wrote the question is willing to prepare a review because he's doing a study through Tithing and Dominion, and if his review is up to editorial snuff, we'd be more than happy to publish it. The more the merrier, we always say. If you have something on your heart, an area of Reconstruction that hasn't been dealt with, send those manuscripts my way, or ping me and say, hey, I'd like to write on this. Would you be interested in publishing it? And if it catches my attention, say, we need to have that. It's areas unaddressed. Areas that are unaddressed are the very areas I want to dig the faith into, to get our feet on, to claim some ground there for Christ. So that's what I'm all about. I have, Doug, before I get to your question, I see Joe Sallen's also listening here. I want to get through these final two questions, then I'll take the live questions. But I see that you have one up there concerning government money for the adopted child. I know I probably should take that because it ties into what I just discussed. But I'm going to do it in this order just because I'm obtuse. There you go. The Babylonian exile is attributed to the Jews failing to observe the Sabbath year land rest for 490 years. 490 years prior to the captivity appears to be around the time of Samuel and Saul. Are we to conclude that the land rest was faithfully observed during the time of the judges and that it was never observed under any of the kings, including the good kings? Or could this be referring to a cumulative 490 years, not necessarily a consecutive 490 years? If it's not necessarily consecutive, what implications might that have for interpreting the 70 weeks of Daniel? The likelihood is it's consecutive, and remember, it's not just one Sabbath every 7 years. There's also the sabbatical years on the 50th years. There's a double Sabbath, one Sabbath that's 2 years long. So that has to also be accumulated. So yes, during the entire reign of the kings, in essence, not a single king, even the good ones, Hezekiah, Josiah, none of them obeyed the land Sabbath laws, nor did they compel anyone to obey them. And therefore, God says, my land shall enjoy her Sabbaths. So the likelihood is that they, and this is the reason, is that they had every opportunity to observe one and set the clock back again. Why do I say that? This, I think, actually ties in with Jesus' comment to Peter, 70 times 7 shalt thou forgive. And this relates back to the land Sabbath. 70 times the 7 is going to be the forgiveness. That's how far long God will forgive before he lowers the boom, the hammer falls. And so too, we can reset the clock, if you will. Not that we should be saying how much sin can we get away with, but that God's forbearance is massive compared to ours. And that's good, because it means he really is a merciful God. And when he finally drops the hammer on us, we have no excuse for it. Absolutely zippo. He's that merciful, and we still blow it. We deserve to be thrown out of the land for 70 years and wander in Babylon. That's exactly Eli's point of view. It's the Lord. Let him do what seems him right. I deserve it. And we need to have Eli's attitude if we come to that same place as Israel came to under the reign of Zedekiah when they were booted out for 70 years. So, yeah, and so therefore I don't believe it has any relationship to the 70 years of Daniel 9, 24 to 27. The excuse would probably be made, well, if they weren't consecutive, then perhaps the Daniel's 70 years aren't consecutive either. Here's the reason why they are consecutive, is that in the Hebrew grammar, in the first verse of Daniel 9:24, it does not read 77s are cut off. It says 77s is cut off. That's a single linking verb, is. That means there's only one cut at each end. There's no individual cuts. If it was to be multiple slices that could be split around, you can stick 2,000 years between the 69th and 70th week, the word would have been R. But it's 60 or 77s is cut off. Decreed really means to cut off. It's a cutting. So the chops are at one end and at the other, 490 years total. And that's the reality of it. You have to fight God on this grammar. And I've heard people actually tell me, on this passage, God might use bad grammar. Flee these people, because they're so dead set on their dogma that they will refuse the word of God when it conflicts with their pet theory, and that's a dangerous thing. They should at least submit to the word of God and say, that's a problem for my position, I better think this through again. But if they say, nah, God uses bad grammar, flee. This is a false teacher who's willing to bend the scripture to their own will, and therefore it's will worship at that point and not eschatology talk. It's not. It's something bad. It's something very, very sad and bad and rampant. The other problem is that it's rampant. People making excuses for the fact that the text of Scripture conflicts with their theories that they want to propagate and essentially pull the wool over the Christian's eyes. Oh, if God uses bad grammar, then, of course, everything is up for grabs. Maybe Jesus is not one with the Father. Maybe there's other ways to be saved other than through the Son. Maybe John 14:6 has some bad grammar in it too. Everything is up for grabs the second that we deny that God knows how to talk straight. You speak with forked tongue, What kind of God is he? No different than Satan. So, final question from our list of submitted ones. Last week, you touched briefly on the choice to be inside or outside an organization to affect change. Could you give a couple of practical examples? That brings an interesting point. What evidences we have of reconstruction in the Bible have always been internal ones. Nehemiah, Ezra is obviously an internal construction within Israel. And so those are the ones that we have in terms of biblical archetypes for that. Yeah, contradicting the intent of the author is pretty sad, isn't it, Doug? That question was by Roger Oliver, my dear friend, missionary out at the Pierre Viera Center in Puebla, Mexico. And so he posed the question, why do we have to be inside the system? Now, let me point out, he's obviously outside the system if he's promoting homeschooling in Mexico, where it's essentially looked down upon. So obviously he's rebuilding, but he's rebuilding at a different level of the culture. He's not trying to rebuild the, if you will, the Mexican governance, except indirectly. He's starting at the ground roots level, and then that's going to percolate, that seed is going to move out. That leaven is going to leaven the culture from inside, but it's not going to be institutionally inside. He may not be inside institutional church, certainly not, say, a Roman Catholic church or a compromised evangelical church. When he's dealing with these situations, he's being faithful to God where he is. So from one point of view, he might be outside the institutional church, but from another point of view, he's in the true church, if you will. He's bringing part of the church that's actually salt, and that salt and light is evident because the enemies of God hate it. They fight it. And some of the compromised church that wants to be buddy-buddy and link elbows with a atheistic state are going to also oppose what Roger Oliver does and say so. But so from one point of view, he feels like an outsider because he has been marginalized, but God is with him over there on the margins. Some have argued from this passage in Hebrews 13 that Jesus went outside the camp. Well, that was simply because he was made sin for us and was therefore rightfully tossed outside the camp. But everything that Christ did up until that point, he was calling on Israel and the people of Israel and to a remnant of Israel to do what's right and calling them to their purpose as the people of God, as the beginning of God's kingdom. And God was going to then use that as a core to build brand new. I will build my church, and then the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. So I don't want to get hung up on, well, if you're going to fix, because the question last week was corporations, and I say they cannot be reconstructed from the outside. They have to be reconstructed from the inside. If you repudiate something, it's already in the toilet, and well, you're not going to go back to the toilet to fix it. But if you're inside it, you're going to say, what can we do to influence this and shape it and be light and salt in here and to redirect it? And there actually are ways. It would be one thing if there was absolutely no way on God's green earth that you could possibly redeem the concept of the corporation in America, and then you'd have to run from it. You'd have no choice. But that's not the truth. See, that's a half-truth. And the full truth is it can be done and has been done and should be done, more to the point, and we're cowardly when it comes to it. We rather be able to say, well, intone these magic words, I have not submitted to any state subordination. And that's magic words, very powerful words. I mean, who wants to? Nobody. It's terrible. No one wants to submit to the state and have the church under Caesar's foot. No one's arguing for that on either side. But the pro-corporation side saying, but you cannot at the same time turn over something that belongs to God to the devil and say it's yours. You win. I've said it earlier this week. Satan only wins victories by forfeit. And the only reason that Satan has the corporation in his fist is because we forfeited. And the solution is not more forfeit. The solution is recover that back from the enemy who has no right to it. So, okay. Now let me scale back. By the way, I have very, very close friends, serious theologians who take the other side, and we agree to disagree, but we each understand each other's position. Paul Michael Raymond and I have some very interesting talks about this. Good afternoon, Roberto. I don't know if you finished that book yet or not. Let's see, there was a question. Okay, maybe I passed it. It's by Douglas. There it is. Would there be anything wrong with putting all government money received for an adopted child into a college fund of some type? Well, there's a problem with it being a college fund of some type. See, that's the some type part. If it's a college fund for a secular education, I wonder about that. And I'm sure that Doug does not mean this. Douglas, I'm sure, means some positive use for the capital. And then, of course, if it's in a fund to begin with, then it's probably tied to fiat currency that is subject to the Federal Reserve's tampering and governmental destruction of that currency. So I'd rather do what Dr. Rushdoony's habit was to move from dollars into gold coins and then accumulate those instead, or silver would have been just as good. That might be a better angle on it, insofar as that is the true biblical wealth, especially if it can be used wisely and isn't confiscated again by the overreaching state. There we go again with the state being the beast, messing up all our plans. The state doesn't like it when its inflation of the money supply is exposed, and one way to expose it is by having in your possession gold and silver, which continually beams out a testimony. That stuff is fake. That paper is worthless. And the state doesn't like to have its lifeblood being attacked. I think the song Paper Blood by Emerson, Lake and Palmer actually references this point in an oblique socialistic way, but nonetheless, the point is taken. Okay, it looks like we are free and clear for questions. Zachary is with us. Are corporations inherently structured like other power centered as opposed to dominion-centered institutions, like state bureaucracy? Again, that depends. The charter is going to determine everything. I think a properly done church corporation charter ties the church, its own existence, back to ancient documents from the 17th century. You would be tying it to the Book of Church Order, the Cambridge Doctrine of Church Discipline. Things and so you say these are the foundational documents that drive this church and its structure. And when you appeal to the past, the rock from whence you were hewn, to use Isaiah's phrase, and the Secretary of State signs off and says, yes, this church is tied to those documents, which are earlier than, say, the state of California's becoming a state. At that point, then the earlier document cast a long shadow over whatever the state tries to tack onto it afterward, and that governs. So so if you can shape it so the Secretary of State signs off on it, you're kind of 90% of the way there. You have established that it's not the state that created you, it's rather that you reach all the way back to the first century, and the acknowledgement is that you are tied architectonically, that's the word we use, in those charters, to these other documents which shape every aspect of the church's life and existence and function and purpose. That's how it's done. So if anyone ever asks how is that done, that is one of the key steps to take. So when you do that, then the institutional question solves itself to a point. What's the point? The point is we didn't have necessarily perfect church polity in the 17th century. There were still arguments and discussions about it. The Puritans were still not settled on theonomy. Ernst Keevan's book, The Grace of Law, points this out. So there was still work to be done. But nonetheless, like I said, 90% of the way there, already locking ourselves in to a 17th century institutional framework, institutional in the sense of we hearken to this. See, historicity is something that the state has to acknowledge. If you put it out there, they cannot deny it. They cannot rewrite the history and say, no, there were no churches that used this form of discipline and this platform and this doctrinal statement back in 1640 or whatever the year might be. Yes, they were, because here they are. We actually attached the documents to the church charter. They became part of the paperwork, if you will, for that church that was founded back in 1984, I think it was, 83, 84, in California, way back when. So it's possible to do, but it's work. It takes a lot of work. Of course it takes work to take something back from Satan. He's not going to let it go easily. You have to be clever as serpents and gentle as doves. But the clever as serpents is very important, part of that. So it's not that it's a matter of power-centered or dominion-centered. It's a matter is what is it sitting on foundationally. Now, the point is the church, even with the most beautiful documentation, most beautiful church covenants and church secondary standards, etc., can still be filled with sinners who are intent on bending everything and figuring out the trick to making it serve their own purpose institutionally. Happens all the time. The verse out of, I believe it's the 7th chapter of Ecclesiastes, God made man upright, but man sought out many devices or machinations. And that's the same thing. God, we prepare all these beautiful secondary standards, these creeds and confessions, and then a church will implement them and then figure out a new way to pervert. So there you go. Sorry, didn't mean to do that. Okay, here's a question from Ground Control. Wouldn't the state school system eventually end if Christian churches established Christian schools for their congregants? Yes. In fact, they would actually happen much earlier than that. Many states, for example, Texas, has a thing known as Snapshot Day. What is Snapshot Day? That's a day when they suddenly say, okay, let's see how many kids are in the school and whether we can keep the school open. So it turns out that the bulk of the schools in Texas are within just a few students of having to close. And they'd be forced to close by their own charters again. There's something about the power of a dead document that works against the state just as well as could work against the Christian. So it's a two-way street. And so here's the sad story, is that if the Southern Baptist Convention had taken seriously the motion continually being fielded to pull all the Baptist children out of the public schools, had they actually ever gotten to a vote rather than being blocked from a vote up there at the podium, then all these schools would have failed the snapshot test, and they would have collapsed. In other words, the Baptists had in their hands the ability to collapse the public school system of Texas and refused to move a finger. They blocked it. They did not want that bomb thrower running up there to make that motion. They wanted to stop that motion dead in its tracks. Now, there's some movement closer to that position, but it has been grievously slow, in my opinion. So we could have done this already in several states, and we don't. It's Christian dereliction and sitting on our hands and saltlessness. How's that saltless salt taste to you guys? Doesn't taste good to God, I'm sure. Okay. And there's another point, is that all these wonderful facilities, I don't know how wonderful they all look like prisons now, don't they? Theoretically available to be rented for other use, repurposed, right? What God meant, men meant for evil, God can mean for good. God could reuse all that. There's nothing that's beyond God's power to reconstruct it. That's the interesting point, except perhaps Satan, of course, and those who've already died in unbelief. Those are trees, having fallen, stay in the position that they've fallen. But everything else is open to the power of God and the promises of God. All right. So, any other new questions here? Let me just check the clock. We've been zipping along. Okay, about 37 minutes in. Not too shabby. Anyone want to say if they can hear me any better now that I'm belting it out? Again, we're going to try to get our Bluetooth device, my little neck band, running next week. Curious why it's not connecting, but once it does, we should have better audio. Otherwise, I'm going to have this massive U87 microphone with a windscreen on it. You won't see my face. You hear my voice, not my face. But it'll be a very pretty windscreen, I'm sure. Okay, now that those what we have now are those silences, which are dead space, which is death to Facebook Live. It really is. Oh, good. Well, Mike likes my audio levels. That's good to hear. And I don't know if it's because I'm shouting or whether my phone is being more cooperative than usual today. For those who don't know, we have just released a review of Dr. Joel McDermott's book, The Bounds of Love. It's in the March-April issue of Faith for Our Life. I alluded to it last week, that it was coming, and it is there now. So if you haven't read it, it'd be worth looking at. Also, the final article related to the Dr. Kishore situation. From this point on, we will let the movie, like I say, do the heavy lifting, which is being finished in post-production. And we also have an excellent little article. Andre has one. Mark has a good piece that's been featured. And Susanna Roundtree, I mentioned it last week, did an excellent piece on medieval slavery, worth looking at because of how it is that Christians are implicated in its propagation. So, how long have I been doing these Q&As? I think since last July we started, June, July. And we try to do them weekly. During the holiday season, we went every other week. And now, for the first time in March, we're back to weekly, haranguing you folks weekly. Once a week, I am there to ignore or to take sustenance from if you think I provide it. But your feedback is valuable to us over here at Chalcedon. Okay, here we have a pinned comment. Comment, please, on women joining the military and possibly eventually being drafted. Actually, this is a long-standing question that has come up repeatedly in Chalcedon. If you're a theonomist, basically it's a big fat no. And it ought not to happen, and the children and the women should not be drafted. This is one of the big failure points of feminism. So many points where it already contradicts Scripture. Some points where, in fact, they're in agreement with Scripture, believe it or not. But this is not one of them. And it's unfortunate that this is being promoted as heavily as it is. So we can simply look it up it's even explicitly forbidden in the Old Testament. The notion that we don't live under the Old Testament law is, of course, the very point in question when you're talking to someone from Chalcedon, because the view that we take is that the New Testament endorses the Old, does not set it aside, and every example of an alleged, and it's called alleged negative passages, that's the way Dr. Bonson put it. Every alleged negative passage, when actually examined dispassionately without an agenda, shows itself to not be negative at all, but rather supplementary and inconsistent with the notion of the law of God, with the exception of the sacrificial systems, is still binding on all mankind, whether we like it or not. Even Dr. Rushdoony, when he was questioned by Mill Moyers, says, I don't necessarily like all the law of God. Some of it rubs me the wrong way, but he's God, and so he has the right to legislate as he sees fit. Therefore, as it reads in the very final verse of Isaiah 33, he is our king, he is our lawgiver, he's our judge, he will save us. 4 offices: savior, legislator, king, and judge. How may we submit questions for future podcasts? That's a good question, Mike. You would email the question to ask.chalcedon@chalcedon.edu. Ask.chalcedon, dot being the period. Ask.chalcedon@chalcedon.edu. And that's how we receive them. We collect them almost up to the last hour before we go on the air. And I print them out, hopefully catch them all in a little Word document, and try to make my way through them. They get first priority before we take the live questions. So you get at top of the stack if you ask right after we close our session. If something comes to mind while we're talking here, and it prompts a question on your part, on your heart, go ahead and fire it off, and it'll be the first one that we touch next week. So, yeah, and of course, ground control there, my dear friends at Chalcedon Foundation and the other coast are giving us that exact link, the email URL there. Nancy, welcome to our wonderful Sunday session. Hope all is well with you too. You're welcome, Mike. So, we're still working on our technology here to get this thing a little bit easier to work. So, as you notice, I might be hitting the water, hitting the bottle more often than off, because I'm trying to speak louder because of some early reports from last week that it's very hard to hear or listen to my Q&As. Not because of the content, I hope, but because of it's too quiet. So I was mentioning that we did, in fact, post a review of Dr. McDermott's book. Worth looking at because that particular book has had an impact on the discussion of theonomy. And I think it would be worth our while to understand it and grasp where it's right and where we believe it is in error. Now, I have a very good positive relationship with Dr. McDermott. I actually gave him a copy of the review to double check for accuracy before we published it. So professional courtesies need to come back in Christian civility, something we can learn from one another, as opposed to what I call the conflagration model of scorched earth criticism and trolling of one another. God's not pleased when we consume one another, backbiting until we're all dead. That's just unfortunate, and it's not edifying. See, one reason I'm even here on these Sunday mornings is that there's a rule laid out by Paul. Let all things be done unto edification. And so we're here to try to build up, to try to explain, try to elaborate, try to fill in questions that people might have. And if it's not edifying, we need to either shut up but certainly shouldn't be shooting our mouths off in an unedifying way, certainly not with heat and argument and scorn And I was just having a conversation with one of my ground control people about that review, and I said, way back in 1981, I wrote a book review. And it was kind of a scorching book review of a book that was pretty bad in every respect. There was nothing wrong with what I wrote. Technically, it was accurate. And I passed it to Dr. Rushdoony for his opinion, and he wrote back just a couple of sentences, very powerful, and had a strong effect on me. He said, "Never be harsh." I said, "Only a well-established writer can get away with being harsh, and then only sometimes." So I rewrote it and took out the harshness, and it was a much better review as a consequence. People could focus on the points, the salient points, the important, relevant points, not my style in dive-bombing somebody and smearing them, say. So that's something that got out of my system way back in 1981, after Dr. Rushdoony walked me through it. He has had a powerful influence on a lot of other folks in regard to this, and in some cases, zero influence if you care to look around, which is unfortunate because it's very, very good advice. Don't be harsh. Only a well-established writer can get away with being harsh, and then only sometimes. I have a pinned question here from Zachary. How much is rationalism to blame for the ignorance of or naivety toward people seeking many schemes in spite of exceptional creeds and foundations? Well, first off, there's the notion that we deify the moment. Those guys are old. They don't know what I'm at. We're in the 21st century. We're in 2018. We're where everything is cool. And we know what they don't know. At least that's the allegation. This is so that epistemologically we are supposedly at the cusp, at the apex of history, and we therefore can afford to look down on the strong discipline of the past, despite the fact that we have zero discipline today. So, remarkably, there's a large amount of smarminess involved in this attitude. Any way but God's way is the basic mantra of the humanist. We will do it anyway except God's way. We will bend everything to avoid doing it what God says. And it's a willfulness in the mind of humanistic man to make man the measure of all things, and therefore God must be demoted at any cost, and his testimony must be demoted. And then when you have consecrated scholarship going back, 20 years worth, 20 centuries of scholarship, that also has to be scorned as people who lived in the dark. You know who kind of contributed to this notion among modern Christians? Take a look at Hal Lindsey. When he wrote Late Great Planet Earth back in 68, 69, published that book, he makes the following comments about Calvin and Luther. They were in darkness concerning prophecy. Well, if they're in darkness about that, how about other stuff? Why should we limit it to that? Maybe they were all in darkness. Maybe the only light is with us. And so we have, and we come back around to the circle of friends of Job, where Job tells his buddies, so-called buddies, yeah, surely wisdom will die with you. So that's where you get. So rationalism, yes, there's a faith that people place in their own intellect. They lean to their own understanding, and they misunderstand who God is. That's usually the big thing. And God is always subordinated in their thinking under other principles, other entities. For example, most common thing is to put God underneath chaos or chance, and put God underneath logic. Whereas God, there is no such thing as these two categories when God is actually at the top. And this is what Van Til spent so much of his time dealing with, is deconstructing this false analysis on which all humanistic thought is premised, on which it advances its position. So this verse about mankind coming up with many schemes, many plans, many machinations, I like that translation, but devices is as good as any, which was the one I think that's used by the King James. The notion is the same. By the way, the big point of that verse in Ecclesiastes is that God made us upright originally, but we've deflected off into all these false paths versus the true path. In other words, to the wide, easy path that leads to destruction. That's where we're all spending our time and energy versus the narrow, straightened path that leads to life. Matthew 7:12-14. Okay, Chalcedon Foundation has a question. How should one proceed with a 30-year mortgage if it cannot be paid off in 6 years? Well, if it cannot be paid off in 30 years, try to pay it off in 29. If it can't be paid off in 20. In other words, you have to move in terms of what you can do to try to reduce it. because money today, American money, is actually built on debt. It is monetized debt. The way that you attack that beast is to get out of debt and to reduce it. So all reduction is better. The place where you're outside of, or at least within what God sanctions as legitimate, is where you're at that 6-year level, paying off in 6 years. And of course, this is an area of dispute among some theonomists. Some theonomists decided to make this a sticking point and an attack point to attack other theonomists on, usually going in defense of a 30-year mortgage. It's been explained by one theonomist, well, the bank and I co-own the house, so it's not really a debt. So this is what we call, at least on the other side of the house, sophistry, false reasoning that makes us feel good, has a look of cleverness and wisdom, but it's not wisdom. You and the bank don't co-own the house, because if you don't pick the payment, you will no longer be a co-owner. So, because the bank's going to say, but that's a loan. So, recasting and reframing things is such a common strategy, and the humans do it all the time. We just learned recently that Social Security is in fact a tax. And that was not how it was built, and how it is. Obamacare was packaged as a non-tax when it was passed by the Congress, and the Supreme Court redefined it as a tax. Boom, boom. So, man seeks out many devices. And there we have it again. So, I think you need to take the steps necessary to quicken or move faster in terms. If you just leave it at a 30, that's twice as bad a transgression, if you will, of God's law than a 15-year debt. And so anything less than a 6-year debt is a problem. Some folks will say, okay, I don't even want to have that on my neck. I will rent in the meantime. And that's very valid, extremely valid. And then it's not your problem at that point. You're renting. You're not under the loan situation. But it is problematic because so many people will rationalize and justify anything more than 6. So I'm saying, if you're at 30 and you can't get to 6, try to get to 15. Try to get to 12. Whatever it is better than what you're doing, because you create more monetized debt and destroy the money supply with the longer that length is. They've actually gone out to 40 and 50 for certain land purchases. And soon we're going to get to the point where we're going to have 10-year loans on a car. And because of the interest rates, the monthly payments are not going to be much better. People get a false impression from that monthly payment. It is a deceptive thing, and it lowers our defenses, and we need to be very cognizant that we are targeted. You look at it. Why is it that the government will encourage debt, say mortgage debt, by saying we will give you an exemption for that on your taxes? But if you're saving money, you earn some interest, we're going to penalize you. So the government, like I've always said, will encourage indebtedness, which is slavery, and discourage thrift by taxing any proceeds that you might get from saving and being thrifty and prudent. So the government is encouraging anti-biblical behavior on both sides of the equation. So keep that in mind. If you want to get out of that, get out of that sooner, even if you can't get out all the way. According to the biblical, a shorter is better than a longer thing, even if it's more than the 6-year limit. Or you can go to renting. How do we resign ourselves that in a humanistic culture we have to be obedient in a patient way? Well, this is kind of what is dealt with in one of the chapters, 3rd chapter of Malachi. And I love this. I actually dealt with this when we were talking about one of these passages. And in the 3rd chapter, he talks about a period of time when you are living in a situation where it's a very humanistic culture, and you have to be patient. It says, then they that feared the Lord, this is Malachi 3:16, then they that feared the Lord spake often one to another, and the Lord hearkened and heard it. And a book of remembrance was written before him for them that feared the Lord, and that thought upon his name. And they shall be mine, saith the Lord of hosts, in that day when I make up my jewels. And I will spare them as a man spareth his own son that serveth him. Then shall ye return and discern between the righteous and the wicked, between him that serveth God and him that serveth not. So there comes a time when all you have that you can do is talk quietly amongst yourselves, because things are so bad. But God sees that. Far from being, man, we are weak, we're sitting here, we're huddled over in this little hovel over here, and things have gone to heck in a handbasket. God obviously is not seeing anything. And here we see in Malachi 3, boom, that God is with you in that process of bemoaning this, and that these days too will pass, that God will not be mocked, that their foot shall slip in due season, as it's promised in Scripture. And then so it will be. Vengeance is God's, and he will repay. In the meantime, we work together as Christians, supporting each other in that patient way. And so we need to be one another's support. If you're in a bad place, call up the phone, visit a brother, get on Facebook, if that's what it takes to, and have a private message with somebody. Say, I have a hard time with this. And we can support one another, and it says, and God sees it and writes up a book of remembrance during these tough times when everything is falling to pieces. That's what's happening in the preceding verse. The proud scatter the God's people, and they kind of are in a bad way. So, already described. We already have an answer in Scripture. It's in Malachi 3:16 and following. It's a good answer, too. Well, what I say, Aaron asked me, are the most important differences between Baptist versus Presbyterian covenant theology. Well, they certainly have differences. The question is, should those differences lead to a failure to join forces for common cause? Co-belligerencies, I think, are very, very important at this time. Who was the brother to the man or neighbor to the man who was in the ditch? It was a Samaritan, the one who showed him mercy. So, too, we tend to not show ourselves mercy because of our theological orientations getting in the way. So, first thing, I think that though there are differences, they need to be discussed in a positive way. One way I could point this out is to examine, if you haven't seen it, and it might even be available online, is an article by Warfield called The Polemics of Infant Baptism. And in that, he takes the arguments from Augustus Strong, taken, I believe, probably from his systematic theology, Strong's systematic, but it's a big list of attacks on infant baptism, why it's a false doctrine. And after Warfield goes through the list, he comments, this is quite a list. We'll need to unpack it piece by piece. But he does so very gently, very calmly, and it shows that it's possible to have a constructive, edifying discussion over a point like this. So I'm not so much concerned that there are differences, that the way we work our way through these differences, because it's in my position that we're not going to get doctrinal unity first. We're going to get organic unity as brothers and sisters first, and the doctrinal unity will come later. We don't deserve the doctrinal unity, and therefore God's going to work with us on our character first, and he uses that difference as a test of character. But it will come. Then Aaron asks a follow-up, which is an interesting follow-up. Does this create differences in perspective on issues of covenantal guilt and social justice? I suppose it's possible, but normally what happens with the social justice issue, and let's be very clear, social justice, as normally defined, is justice for groups. And consequently, defined that way and promoted that way, which is the usual way it's promoted, it is in opposition to individual justice. And the reason that's important is that the Bible acknowledges just one kind of justice, individual justice. So if you have a group of 1 million people who are enslaved, then the Bible treats it as 1 million cases of individual justice that need to be dealt with, not as one case of group justice. That's the big difference. Because in order to have group justice, you have to get rid of individual justice. You basically then are judged based on what group you're in versus what you've done. And in the Scripture, you stand or fall by your own personal actions and volitions. And this is not the case when social justice prevails. So, but if we're talking about social justice and dealing with concerns about our society at large, like poverty or drug addiction, crises that affect our fellow man, then those are important things that we do need to deal with. And how we approach them, a lot of that has to do with our notion of what the nature of the kingdom of God is. If you're saying it's purely spiritual, then you're going to say, be warm and comforted, and you're going to fall into the trap that James depicts for those who actually are violating God's law. Because God, if nothing else, is the father of the fatherless and the widow. Douglas asks, And I've got only a couple of minutes left before they're going to shut me down because we don't want to have 2-hour-long Q&As. But I'm coming every week, so it won't be so bad. Douglas asks, many translations have started changing the word charity to love. When this happens, which way do you apply your application? So that word, actually, a very strong case has been made that the best translation for it is forbearance, believe it or not. So we're going to have to leave this for next week. I'll put a notation up. The proper translation of that word into English, what it means and how we should take it and how we should apply it. So it's a very, very good question. I like it. And therefore, we're going to spend more time with it next week. Let's see, any final questions? Ever since you last addressed this question, Martin, I have always asked a clarifying question. How can you have social justice without individual justice? Technically, you can't, but you see the social justice warriors don't care. You have group guilt, you understand? See, the Bible only talks about individual guilt with the exception of federal guilt under Adam, which is a whole different theological matter. Under humanism, you have group guilt. So the very fact that your skin is a certain color would implicate you whether or not you individually did anything harmful on the principle that you may have somehow benefited, even if your forebears came from Europe at the time or someplace where various enormities weren't inflicted on people of a different color. So we'll have to deal with this. Okay, so I'm getting these messages from ground control. We'll see you all next week. Remember, tomorrow, Book of the Month Club, led by Gordon Runyon and Andrea Schwartz, on the dangers of Neoplatonism. It's a very serious current concern, and you definitely want to be part of it. So sign up if you possibly can. It's going to be great. Catch all of you next week. God bless you all. Thank you for listening.